Thank you very much, Anna, and I'm pleased to say I'm joined now by the Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace. Thank you very much for being with us on this day. Appreciate your time. And if you just cast your mind back a year and when you first heard that Russian forces had crossed the border, when you were hearing that explosions had taken place in this capital city, what was going through your mind?
Well, I think the first thing was, I got in touch with my counterpart to see that he was all right. And I think the first thing is, is everyone all right? And, it was very important for me. I'd been to visit Ukraine a number of times, both as Security Minister and Defence Secretary. And, I know people out there, and I was obviously very concerned. I was also sort of filled with a bit of sadness because despite international efforts, both adversary and friend had done their very best to try and persuade Russia not to follow this foolish course. They were just determined to press on. And then lastly, I remember going into the office and saying very early on, early in the morning, we have to give Ukraine hope. We have to show the world and we have to show them in Ukraine and the media, we have to show that Russia is not infallible, that in fact that it can fail at this. And if there is any media or stories that demonstrate, like your own reporting and other reporters, that show Russia is not having a success, we must make sure that people know that far and wide, because it's the hope that has driven these brave Ukrainians to doing what they're doing. And it's the hope that I think helped gel the international community beyond the initial sort of horror of the invasion.
So let's look ahead then. Boris Johnson told me yesterday that the UK should, in his words, break the ice and send jets to Ukraine. Are we going to do that?
No, we're not going to send our own Typhoon jets in the short term to Ukraine. We've been quite clear about that. And, I think, the one thing I've learned in this conflict, as you probably have as well, Mark, is you can't rule anything in and rule anything out. But I've also watched, embryonic sort of military aid start with handheld anti-tank missiles that Britain was the first in Europe to give before the conflict, growing to now gifting, over nearly 200 Western tanks, and helicopters have gone in huge amounts of equipment from the international community. So I've watched it grow. The key thing here is it's not a sort of ad hoc plan. It's often in response to the needs on the ground of the Ukrainians, but also it's about a realism. We have designed our forces to fight in a NATO way, and that is not the original design that the Ukrainians inherited when they broke away from the Soviet Union. So what we have to do is make sure that when we gift anything, that in some cases we gift the training and the capabilities alongside it. So, for example, gifting a fighter jet, Mark, comes with hundreds of people, raw, engineers, pilots, training, electronic warfare. Then, the more complicated the platforms, the greater the tail. And, the West is not going to be putting troops into Ukraine in those scales. The idea that, we would put Typhoon in, you'd have to send 200 RAF people, and we're not going to do that. We've said that quite clearly in this current stage. But what we have offered is that if a country wants to gift a Russian or a Soviet model, like a MiG-29, and there are some countries in NATO who have them, then Britain will do its very best to either backfill with our own jets or indeed provide some form of air policing to cover their loss of vulnerability and capability. I think that's quite an important message. That's what the US did in Poland, I think, with tanks. The Poles donated over 200 T-72s, and they were backfilled by American Abrams. That is one of the methods we've been using over the last year.
OK, so that you're pretty clear, no Typhoons in the near term. What do you make of Deborah Haynes' reporting yesterday that UK weapons and ammunition stores are so low that it risks not being able to support Ukraine or keep Britain safe? How short are we of weapons and ammunition?
Well, first of all, very few countries openly talk about their scale of stockpiles, because to do so would to leave them vulnerable to the enemy knowing what you have in your bunkers, effectively. But look, it's not a new observation that this Ukraine war and the way Russia was fighting has shown across the West that our stockpiles over the last 3 decades have often borne the brunt of defence cuts, or indeed, the hollowing out that you've heard me talk. And we have to restock those. Now, Britain has early on already started restocking them. Again, what it's also exposed is that if you think, for example, the NLAWs, the anti-tank missiles that we put in last January, Britain, into Ukraine, we've been placing orders for these things. We've been buying them in the thousands. Then once that order's fulfilled, the supply chain's gone and done something else. And so you don't just sort of switch a button. You have to reheat that supply chain, and that's been a challenge across the board.
I get that.
But we are fixing it.
Our stock, though, are you worried about our stock?
I'm not worried about our stock for two reasons. One is we've now started to place orders to replenish them, and where we haven't placed orders, we've started the work to make sure we have the supply chain or find alternative sources. And I've already been receiving now some more NLAWs, those anti-tank missiles, and some low-velocity anti-aircraft missiles into our stocks, and there are more on the way of other types. And the second reason I'm not as worried is, the big thing that Putin respects and is frightened of is the NATO alliance. That's 30 nations. So remember, we are, by our strength, an alliance. We are heart of an alliance of those 30 countries. If anyone attacks a NATO member, we have a mutual self-defense. That's Article 5, off each other, and that ultimately gives us our power. So we have a coalition to help support us alongside the fact we are starting to restock.
Okay, are there any plans, just to be clear, are there any plans to ramp up production of ammunition and weapons stocks because of the war in Ukraine?
Absolutely, and those plans have been made public for about 6 months. We've talked about them, and we have either negotiated with them, and I joined a deal a few months ago with Sweden and Finland and Britain to collectively buy more NLAWs. We've started doing that. I've visited the factories and spoken to the leadership of these companies, either internationally trying to work together or indeed individually. So these are not new plans. They have been in place. Some of the supply chains take time to reheat, and I've been very honest about that. I play with a pretty straight bat about those things to make sure that that you can't just switch a button, because you've got to manage people's expectations. But we're definitely on the job of that. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak gave me an extra 500 million at the budget to start restocking, the autumn statement, and so we're on the way.
How would you describe your conversation with the Treasury over defence spending? Are you confident of getting an increase in defence spending?
Well, over the years, I've had many conversations with the Treasury, and the Chancellor, the Prime Minister, indicated in the autumn statement something we all agree with, which is that defence needs a greater proportion of spending, or greater amount of spending. I think the statement in autumn was clear about that, in recognition about the growing global insecurity. And of course, I have a spending package that takes me for another 2 years at the envelope. And all I'm really in the position in this moment is trying to negotiate around those lessons we're seeing from Ukraine, and whether there are any increased risks since our last budget settlement. And I'm not going to carry that out in public, but I'm a Secretary of State. Secretary of States often have discussions with Treasury, whether you're the Department of Health Secretary of State or whether you're the Transport Secretary of State. Of course, we have these conversations.
Okay, and just finally, Defence Secretary, China is publicly saying that it wants to be a peacemaker between Russia and Ukraine. But is it your understanding that China is about to give weapons to Russia?
Well, I've seen the reports in the media and the United States observations, and I think it can't help the peace if China effectively supplies the one nation that has broken the international law and the sovereignty of Ukraine and been inflicting war crimes. That will not help the peace. But I'm also confident that China is pretty clear that it wants this to stop. And, we'll see the details of the 12-point plan. I haven't actually seen them yet. But ultimately, China knows that Russia's behavior has been destabilizing. What's been interesting over the year is that a country that is allegedly, in Russia's eyes, a friend of it, that China, has been abstaining at the UN. It hasn't voted with Russia many times at all. And I think that's quite telling, that if your big neighbour doesn't actually vote actively in support of you, I think it's sending a strong message to President Putin that this is an unwise and a folly decision that he's gone down, and that he should cease.